Hi, and welcome to another edition of Ruins of Empire with your host, Rafael Pinheiro. This is the first video of the new year, and I'd like to apologize in advance for the fact that I didn't release any videos over the holidays. The reason for it is simple. Where I live, it's pretty noisy, and the way we celebrate not only New Year's, but both Christmas and Epiphany is with a lot of parties, a lot of noise, a lot of firecrackers, and it's very difficult to basically remove that from any audio track. So finally, I think I got a quieter moment, and I'll be able to record a new video, especially the audio for a new video. So what are we doing tonight? Well, we're going to be talking about the concept of premises and promises. A premise is essentially a sort of a seed, if you will, of an argument, the basis of an argument, or in the case of literature and video games, it is sort of the foundation, sort of the kernel of what is to come. It's also used as a hook to sell the audience on the product, right? For example, in books, the premise usually is found on the back of the box or the book blurb, right? And it's just about, a hero goes and will save the galaxy from the bad guys, kind of thing, or a premise of a movie. It's a unlikely group of heroes unite to save the galaxy. I know what you probably know, or an unlikely group is going to survive the apocalypse, the zombie apocalypse, something like that. And essentially, with every premise, there is an inherent promise that, in fact, reading the book, watching the movie, or playing the game will have that element in it. That the heroes will get together and save the galaxy. That the group of unlikely friends will survive, at least some of them, the zombie apocalypse. And stuff like that. And the way you breach the gap between the premise and the promises in that premise is through a series of questions. Like, for example, who are these unlikely heroes? Why they are stuck in the middle of a zombie apocalypse? How are they going to survive the zombie apocalypse? Etc., etc., etc. And as the narrative goes, you get answers to those questions. And the project can succeed or fail depending on how well those answers are given or delivered to the audience during the course of the production of a movie or a book, etc. In video games, premises go one step further because they essentially tend to set up the win condition, right? It's not simply, an unlikely group of heroes that will survive the apocalypse. It's the player character will be a member of this, or perhaps a leader of this unlikely group of heroes, of friends, and they will have to battle through the apocalypse. The hero, the protagonist, the player character is the one that does the thing, right? They go and do what needs to be done, and eventually at the end of the game, you come up to the fulfillment of the promise inherent in the premise, and that is that you will, in fact, have survived the zombie apocalypse. And just keeping that example going so you can get what I'm trying to say here. And so video games are very good at doing that. They're very good at delivering on those promises. But of course, we're talking about Dragon Age 2 and an example of what happens when you, don't. Now, a little backstory on Dragon Age 2. And Dragon Age 2, of course, was a sequel to Dragon Age Origins. And the premise of Dragon Age Origins is like many BioWare games, is, big evil will come to the land, galaxy, whatever, and the special group of heroes will confront them and defeat them. Very simple, straightforward premise, etc. The premise of Dragon Age 2, on the other hand, as at least you saw in the advertising, trailers, and of course in the back of the blurb, in the back of the box, was Hawk Rise to Power. Different, but intriguing, right? It suggested a tonal shift away from big villain will destroy everything and you are the only person or persons, people that can stop it, right? And the game sort of teases you with that along the way, right? You start the game with nothing, right? You're escaping, running away from the Blight in Ferelden. And then you get to Kirkwall, and you arrive at Kirkwall with nothing, and you start doing jobs. And then the first major plot line is around getting enough money to launch an expedition that, of course, will make you even more money. And then, of course, you get a title. You get the title of the Amels back to your family, specifically to your mother, but she being, your mother, you get the title and the benefits for you. And so constantly the game teases you with the idea that yes, you're going to at some point rise to power. The problem is the game never delivers. Now at this point, people who are playing the game going like, oh, but you become the champion of Kirkwall and you get a mansion, and if you are dating Isabella, you also get a yacht. Well, that's an old Looney Tunes joke, which you want to Google mansion and yacht and Looney Tunes, you'll probably find out what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it's not really important. What is important is that the story seems to suggest, right, that yes, you have risen to power. But the problem is that even the story itself, at the point where you would think that you're risen to power, it in fact denies you that. Because yes, you do get a mansion, you do get a title, but you don't get to do anything with it. In fact, the moment that section of the game is over, that is the defeat of the Arrowshock, which grants you the title of Champion of Kirkwall, the next thing that happens is you get a cutscene and Varric tells you, yeah, well, supposedly, Hawke is the most powerful person in Kirkwall and the most popular, but someone is more powerful. Someone is standing in your way to that ultimate rise to power, which would be becoming the Viscount of Kirkwall. Right, because the old Viscount and his son are dead, so there's a vacancy. There's really no appointed leader in Kirkwall. Perfect for the champion of Kirkwall to become also the Viscount of Kirkwall. But again, that doesn't happen, right? And this could have been. It was also one of the problems with the game is that the game sort of goes beyond what a normal game would go. If you're talking about a strictly narrative sense of champion rising to power, then the game would have stopped after the defeat of the Arrowshock, right? The first part of the game would have been, arriving to Kirkwall. The second part of the game would be how you become rich and influential. And the third part of the game, final part, would have been how you become the champion of Kirkwall by defending the city, either striking a deal with the Arrowshock or defeating him in single combat or just, killing him in a brawl, right? And the friends you had along the way and that sort of thing. And then after you become champion of Kirkwall, usually there would be a cutscene or cinematic saying, well, Hawke became the champion, and with no one to take the place of the Viscount, he or she became the new Viscount, and the story. And so, narratively speaking, yes, you are informed that you rise to power. But the game doesn't stop there. It continues with the whole issue of the Templars and the mages and the Knight Commander Meredith and stuff like that. In fact, it suggested that the last, block between you, the last barrier between Hawke's actual rise to power, and therefore achieving what the premise of the game promises is, Knight Commander Meredith. So the moment you deal with Knight Commander Meredith, you'll be rising to power. Now, I'm going to hold on to that for a little bit. I'm going to come back to that confrontation later, which is the final confrontation in the game, because there's also another aspect of this. Remember, this is a video game, and I always held the fact that the first axiom of video game design is gameplay is the thing. If there are no gameplay elements and no game mechanics that allow you to do the thing that you're supposed to do, right? Which is, for example, kill a monster or explore a dungeon or gain a resource or exploit a resource, craft something, etc. And many myriad of game mechanics you can have in any one moment, then it doesn't really happen, right? You can have someone tell you that it happened, but it doesn't carry the same way. That's a non-interactive aspect of the game. you have to allow for, in fact, give the player the tools to do the thing that you supposedly set them out to do. In other words, to fulfill the win condition, right? Set up by the game. In this case, again, is Hog's Rise to Power. So just having a mansion, right, which is just another location for, to get quests and store stuff, it's no different. It's just basically a different location. You switch from being in low town and very confined area to being in high town. Really no big difference there. The only real property you acquire that sort of gives you some kind of money, and doesn't even give you a lot of money constantly, just it gives you a series of quests, which can give you both experience points and magical items and money, just like every other quest in the game. Has to do with the mine, right? And sort of kind of gives you a sense that you're invested in the economy of the game. But that's it, right? Everything else is just a typical adventure stuff, just running around, killing stuff, usually the same stuff over and over again, in the same places over and over again. You make no deals, no treaties. In fact, in the last part of the game, when you feel like you are doing some quest that in fact will position you to challenge Meredith in a socioeconomic way, in a political way, that quest line just gets cut off, right? It's a quest line where you're going to talk to different nobles that are plotting against Meredith. You can say, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to follow it up. It just ends up with a big fight and everybody going on their own way. The same thing happens if you say side with the mages. It's a good chance that the Anders will do his thing, right, on his own, and at no point do they talk to you and go like, yeah, I'm planning to do this. I think you can if you romance him, but I didn't bother doing that. That seems to be a very narrow way of finding out what's going on, or if you constantly talk to him, but you sort of have to figure out that he's going to do this, and there's really no way to position that into your favor or to stop it. Again, to your favor, or to favor one side or the other. You're supposed to side with one or the other, but of the groups. But again, it doesn't really matter. And at the end of the game, it doesn't. There's no mechanics that substantiate that, and really, the narrative also ignores it in many ways, or works against you in that sense. There's Sebastian Vale, which is a leader of another city in the Free Marches. You would think, well, if I'm rising to power, it would be a good idea to position this important person in the leadership of this other city. Again, you don't get to do that. It's just sort of, yes, you try to encourage them, but they just stick around because they're party members, so you have to have them around. I think it's exemplified both in a narrative sense and in a gameplay sense when you walk into the former Viscount's office, I suppose, or throne, and you are met with either the king or queen of Ferelden, and Meredith is already talking to them and dismisses them and treats them like an idiot, especially when you're talking to Alistair. And I says, oh, I wanted to talk to you, but Meredith cut me off, so it's like, oh, well, what can I do for you? Well, no, you can't do anything. There's no quest I'll sign with that. There's nothing you can actually do for Alistair as king of Ferelden that would elevate you and signal that in fact you are someone who has actual power in Kirkwall, right? So it's a wasted opportunity. It's like, well, I wish I could have had this moment. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen at all. It's like, oh yeah, there's a suggestion that you can do that. I would argue, I think the closest you get to it is helping. The character I blanked out completely on the character right now. Aveline. Aveline is a character. Helping Aveline become captain of the guard. But again, that doesn't give you any real gameplay benefits. So there's no gameplay element that really signifies the rise of power. And there's a reason for it. So now we go back to the narrative sense, right? There are no gameplay elements, and the narrative kind of keeps teasing you with this rise to power, but it doesn't deliver. So finally, at the end, you have this big boss fight, kind of similar to what happened in Denerim, but not really. Your friends are there, and your sibling, if they're alive, shows up again and stuff like that, and you fight and you win. And guess what happens? What happens is that literally Hawk and whoever happens to be with them in the party, they turn around and they leave. Now, that is something that if you were listening to the cutscenes between Varric and Cassandra, you kind of get an idea that Hawk is somewhere else, right? But you could have been forgiven, as I probably, felt the first time around, that it wasn't simply that Hawk wasn't in their mansion, right? But I wasn't really aware of the fact that Hawk just simply abandoned the city. Of all the things that you're supposedly doing for the city, you're the champion of the city of Kirkwall. At the moment when the city needs you the most, at the moment where, the city is vulnerable to attack by more Templars, or be taken over by these rebel mages, whatever, Hawk just walks away. It's like Hawk has spent well over a decade in the city. Supposedly he's invested in the city. He's been called the champion of the city. And says, you know what? I'm leaving. So the game not only, this is really sort of a sin, and it's really the real problem with the game. The game not only sets up a premise and doesn't fulfill it, it abandons it. It says, you know what? Doesn't matter. We're done. Right? That might work, again, in passive media. It's kind of a nice twist in a book or even a movie. It kind of be probably unsatisfying, but you can pull it off, right? Because it's someone else's story. But in this game, particularly in BioWare games, you are basically made to care for the character and to customize your character, right, as you go along, to make Hawk your Hawk, to make your Shepard your Shepard, to make any other characters your character, right? And so to have your character go, yeah, I've been spending over a decade and killing a bunch of people and getting some money and just hanging around, lost all my family, I'm done. I'm out. Forget about it. I'm done. Peace. And you're like, but now it's a time that, Meredith is gone. Now is the time for you to step up and become the champion, blah, blah, blah. And yes, I know people probably playing Dragon Age Inquisition going like, oh no, but there's a reason for this. And Dragon Age Inquisition says that, you know what, that is that is Dragon Age Inquisition trying to validate this game. You don't do that, especially not in video games. Now, win conditions and premises can be very fluid, right? There's two things again to consider. First of all, like I mentioned in the example in the beginning with the zombie apocalypse, a zombie apocalypse game, a sort of kind of survival horror game, there's really no expectation that you're gonna go and fight this great zombie thing at the end and kill all the zombies or find the zombie cure. The premise within has several promises and also several understandings. The audience understands it's all about surviving. So the win condition is you survive, right? You get to live another day. Right? That's part of the premise here. But in Dragon Age 2, which is part of a fantasy milieu and also has both the preceding game and the game that follows it, being games about conquering, right? In fact, you even get, after you fight the battle with Meredith and you defeat her, you actually get a conqueror achievement, even though you haven't conquered anything. You're not the ruler of Kirkwall, so you haven't conquered anything. You defeated just another, basically, trash mob, if you will. But you're told that, you have this achievement of being a conqueror. Whatever that means. It means nothing. But the game tries to sort of sells you on the idea that it does. If the premise of the game is that you're going to rise to power, then you have to have the mechanics and the narrative elements that actually show, consistently and solidly show, that in fact you have done just that. You can delay that, right? And kind of like the delay that I talked about, how the game just does things by thirds and delays things, could be justified, could be found to be tolerable at least, if at the end of the game you actually get to do what you supposedly set out to do. But here the game does the opposite. It actually abandons it. I'm done. We're done. So it feels like, and I certainly felt like when I finished the game, it's like, wait a minute, I spent how many hours playing this game? And I spent how much money in this game? And I got to do jack blank here? What the ever-living F, man? What is this? The game fails utterly into delivering onto the promises and answering the questions inherent in that premise. It doesn't do it. It literally abandons the premise. It says, you know what? I don't want to do it. Now, there's another aspect to this before we close, which will be a relatively short video, is that there's an element here. It's like the game could have been very good, right? Because it does something that very few games do. Like I said before, video games, I apologize for that, are very good at delivering on their premises, right? And usually tying the premise with the win condition. And usually the game is finished when you fulfill the promise or promises in the premise, right? By defeating the bad guy, by surviving the apocalypse, by doing whatever it is that was the setup, right? It's one of the reasons why I say that if defeating the Arachog would have been the end of the game, then that would have been a very normal game. The game would have been substandard. It would have been par for the course for any CRPG. It would still been kind of substandard for a Dragon Age game, a BioWare RPG, but it would have been, functional, right? It was like, okay, I get it. You play the game, you defeated the Arachog, this is the big bad, and you won and you got the city, right? But this game does something that another game also became very infamous for failing to deliver, Fable 3 did. And that was that after you defeat the bad guy, right, the game continues. Now, at least in Fable 3, you got to be the king, right? The mechanics were a bit wonky and they were not very well implemented, but you got to own territory, you got to make decisions and judgments as a king, and you went on to quest to defeat the ultimate evil that comes at the end of the game. But here, again, there's none of that. And here's a situation that, in fact, is very rare, not only in video games, but also rare in most media, because it's difficult to pull off. And I think it's something that the game was aiming for, but again, failed utterly and found itself that I think the creators were like, at the end of it, it's like, well, we failed this, so we're going to call it quits. We're going to have Hawk basically run away from the situation. And that is evolving your premises. Now, how you do that? Well, I mentioned before that in every premise, there's one or more promises. And then the link between the premise and the promise, the way you fulfill that promise inherent in the premise, is by answering certain questions, right? The thing is, and you probably know, is that whenever you answer a question, there's a good chance that answer is going to spawn more questions. Ergo, if you answer those questions, those new questions are based on new premises that you establish in those answers, which means that now you have new promises built in new premises, and so on and so forth. You evolve the premise. You start with something like Hawk rise to power, and then you can say, no, Hawk's real job is to, bring order to Kirkwall, or, something like that, or defend Kirkwall against something, the outside threat of the Templars, or the interior threat of the mages, or something like that. Because I think basically the game sort of attempts to answer the question, now what? You rose to power, supposedly. If we take for what the game tries to sell us, and the idea that becoming the champion of Kirkwall and getting a title of nobility is all the rising to power you need, right? It's clear evidence of that. And you do so by defeating the Arachog as well as doing the expedition, then the question is, okay, now what? But again, that would have been a perfect example of evolving the premise, right? But instead, the game decides, you know what, we're going to keep delaying it. We're going to try to delay it so that at the very end of the game, we end up with, the fulfillment of the premise. But again, which makes the abandoning of that premise even worse. It's like, yeah, we were going for that, but we don't really know how to do that, and therefore we're just gonna go. You know what? Whatever, we're done, right? It makes the whole game feel and the whole experience feel hollow and empty, right? And a complete waste of time. So not only did the game fail to fulfill the premise effectively, especially in gameplay, but also in a narrative sense, it fails to, it abandons the premise. It also fails to evolve it. So it was a great chance to evolve the premises. You know what? In most games, like I said many times before in this video, you win the game when you defeat the big bad, right? But no, we're going to explore what happens next, right? if you're going to do that, you need a narrative and you need a set of gameplay elements that's substantiated. And this is very interesting because both Dragon Age Origins, specifically the DLC Awakening, and Dragon Age Inquisition all have a set of mechanics. For example, in Dragon Age Origins, you have the Battle of Denerim. And during the Battle of Denerim, you have a very simple mechanic which you can call up reserves. You can call up members of the army that you gather throughout the game to help you out in different areas. It's a very simple mechanic. It basically is a group of bots, right? It's NPCs, computer control NPCs. But it gives you a sense that in fact you are a commander, that you're in charge and you can summon these reserves. In Awakening, you have a series of quests and decisions that you have to make over your castle, whether or not you spend money to reinforce the walls, whether or not you seek material to make your knight's armor stronger, whether or not you go to decide whether you're going to mobilize your troops in favor of the city or the countryside and stuff like that. None of these mechanics are extremely complex, but they give you a sense of the fact you are, in the case of Awakening, the commander of the Grey, right? You are the feudal lord of this area, and therefore you are, commanding, right? You are, in fact, have power and are exercising that power. Dragon Age Inquisition has literally a power mechanic where your power and influence grows. You have a war table, where you can send, through your assistants, agents to deal with different situations militarily or diplomatically or through stealth and what have you. So it has a set of mechanics. None of these mechanics are very complex, and the bulk of the game is still very much running around, killing stuff and gathering treasure and having power. But it has these mechanics that actually give you the sense that you are in control, that you have reach, that you have actual power, socioeconomic power, political power, right? It has scenarios and quests to do that. So there is a tradition in Dragon Age Origin of doing that. And the tradition continues in Dragon Age Inquisition, but in the game that has a premise that says, character A will rise to power, nothing, or very little to nothing. Right? Again, it's very frustrating. You have a tradition of doing these things. Why didn't you do it in this game, right? And so, what are the lessons to be learned from this game? First of all, remember, in video games are an interactive medium. They're all about, the player doing the things that you set up in the premise. And usually the premise is set up as, in fact, the win condition, the victory condition. The reason why the player is playing the game. There is an expectation that, in fact, you will get to do whatever it is that you set up as a premise, right? That's one of the reasons why many games have simplistic premises. The simpler the premise, the better, because it's also simpler to deliver on it. It's how you deliver on the premise and makes many games distinct, right? It's like the old, why is it that many games have saving the princess as a premise? Because it's very simple. You play the game, you get to the end of the game, and you save the princess, right? Not very complicated as far as that concept is concerned. What makes a game interesting is how do you go from point A to point Z? How do you start the game all the way to where you get to save the princess, right? It's an old and hackneyed premise, but it's one that is simple and therefore works. Also, if you are going to push the boundaries and you're going to evolve the premise, you have to be very careful to actually do evolve the premise, right? You have to have, answer those questions inherent in the premise that come from the promises in the premise, and take those answers and use them as base for new premises. Right? Don't abandon them just because you couldn't figure out what to do next, right? If you do that, you failed, right? Just like if you failed to deliver in the original premise, you will also fail to if you fail to evolve your premises. And that's the reason a lot of designers don't do that, because it's not easy. But if you can manage to pull it off, you'll be ahead of the curve. Third, again, emphasis on game mechanics. You have to have game mechanics that allow the player to do the thing that you set them to do. You can have the prettiest story ever with, great voice actors. But if you don't have game mechanics and the player hasn't done the thing that they set out to do, it's a waste of time. A movie, television show, etc., I can watch someone else. I can read about someone else doing their thing. And actually, I expect them to be able to do it in those media as well. I'm not expected to do it myself, but I expected that someone will do it, right? Specifically the main character at some point, alone or with help or what have you. But, you know, things happen. You can have a twist where things don't come out exactly as they expected. That's fine. But again, there's an expectation of delivering on the premise, right? Otherwise, either the premise was a wrong premise, doesn't fit the product, or you failed at what is it you set out to do. So those are the lessons to be learned from this situation. This will be the second to last Dragon Age 2 video. I hope that you enjoyed this video and it was informative. I apologize, I've been kind of cold. I haven't done a lot of videos in a while, so getting back into it, it's a bit difficult. Hopefully you have more videos coming on. There's a final video in this Dragon Age 2 series which will talk about what the game could have been. The possibilities embedded in the code, if you will. And I think that's one of the things that is the biggest disappointment of the game, is that this game could have been so much more, but it wasn't. And perhaps if you're the one designing your new RPG, fantasy RPG, these ideas might be something that you may want to explore and roll with it. Okay. So again, thank you for watching and listening. I hope you comment and subscribe, and I'll see you when I see you. Good night.
So, did you...
Gone. Just like the Warden.
That is no coincidence.
So, do we proceed with the original plan? Or keep looking?
It is in the Maker's hands now. We put our faith in him.